Welcome to the e-learning course for Asprova hands-on training. 2i. Creating a prototype. Advanced settings for adding heat treatment process. Starting Asprova. Click on the Start button to display the Windows Start menu. Select Programs, Asprova APS, Asprova from the menu to start Asprova. Open the project file. Select File, Open from the main menu and select as2i.ar4 from the folder Basic 2i to 2j to open the Asprova project file for this training section. After implementing Asprova, ABC Corporation carried out market research and discovered that most of their users of product AX now think that safety is more important than a low price, which was once their highest concern. Driven by this fact, and in order to secure a larger market share, the company has decided to provide an option of adding heat treatment to the production process to enhance the important component A, for which strength has been a problem. To support the heat treatment option, they will change the production process as follows. The existing process is cutting, processing, checking, but the new process will become cutting, processing, heat treatment, checking. They are planning to provide the following options as heat treatment methods: no heat treatment, which is the existing production process, low temperature treatment, medium temperature treatment, and high temperature treatment. There is one in-house furnace that is used for heat treatment. However, since this resource is already in heavy use, it is likely that the furnace will not be able to keep up with demand. For this reason, they have decided to outsource operations according to the following conditions. For orders with quantity less than 100, they will use the in-house furnace HT1. For orders with quantity greater than or equal to 100, they will outsource it to HTG. The in-house furnace has the following 8 characteristics. 1. It is a batch process type furnace that takes a fixed processing time of 6 hours regardless of the quantity. 2. As long as processing temperatures are the same, the furnace can perform 3 operations simultaneously. 3. Since the furnace door should not be opened during the treatment, items to be simultaneously processed should be put in and taken out at the same time. 4. If you want to change the processing temperature, a setup will be required according to the temperatures before and after the treatment described. 5. A worker must be present during setup and production. 6. The furnace worker works from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock. 7. The furnace is used to produce another product that is currently not included in Asprova's schedule. Therefore, it has been decided that item A is to be processed on Mondays and Tuesdays only, and in general, the furnace will be reserved for another product on the other days. 8. Once items are put in the furnace, the production will not be stopped. The outsourced company that undertakes the heat treatment has the following characteristics. 1. It takes time to transfer the items from the company's factory to the outsourced company. Usually, the outsourced company can start processing the next morning after the in-house process ends. Detailed scheduling in the outsourced company is left to themselves, and in Asprova, the outsourced process is scheduled at infinite capacity with a fixed lead time of 2 days. Let's look at the setting of Asprova's tables. First, we'll start with the Integrated Master Editor table. In the Processor Selector column, values 1 and 2 are entered, meaning that 2 patterns of production processes are specified. Process Selector 1 corresponds to the existing production process, and Process Selector 2 corresponds to the process including the heat treatment. These settings indicate that even when you produce the same item A, there can be two methods: producing with heat treatment and producing without heat treatment. Let's take a look at the heat treatment process. For process HT, a candidate resource HT1 is specified, and a fixed time of 6 hours is specified as its capacity. Let's take a look at the other tables. First, let's take a look at the shift table. The shift table is set as shown. Now, let's take a look at the calendar table. In the calendar table, you can see that resource HT1 is set in a way that it can be used from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock on Mondays and Tuesdays, but cannot be used on the other days. Finally, let's take a look at the order table. 24 orders for item A have been entered, some with quantities of 100 and others with quantities of 50. Let's go to the resource Gantt chart. Reschedule. While the 24 orders have been assigned, only one of the two registered production processes, producing without the heat treatment, seems to be deployed. In the following sections, we will perform step by step the remaining settings required to make the schedule use the heat treatment process as described in the scenario background. Let's take a look at how we can specify the order spec for processing temperature. In Asprova, you can specify arbitrary attributes such as temperature, color, length and width by assigning aliases to properties spec 1, spec 2, spec 3 and spec 4. In the case of ABC Corporation, since setup times and production processes change depending on the processing temperature, we will assign the name temperature to the property spec 1 and specify processing temperatures. You can specify spec values for either orders or items. If you specify spec values for an order, the values will apply as spec of that order. If you specify spec values for an item, the values will apply to orders for which no spec value is specified. Since ABC Corporation uses item code A for the item regardless of the heat treatment method, we will specify spec values using the order table. Let's open the order table and change the name of spec 1. Right-click on the cell displaying the name spec 1 and select Property Definition. In the Properties window, select the Comment tab and type Temperature for alias. After you have set the alias to temperature, click the OK button. Next, for each order, enter the temperatures, such as N, no heat treatment, H, high temperature, M, medium temperature, and L, low temperature. Next, we will specify a process selector valid condition. If the property temperature of an order is L, M or H, then that order should go through the heat treatment process. But if it is N, the order should not go through the heat treatment process. we can specify this type of condition in the process selector valid condition. Change to the integrated master editor table. Select the cell of the process selector valid condition field that is next to the cell showing 1. In the Properties window, click the ... button in the Value field of the process selector valid condition property. The process selector valid condition dialog appears, and in the expression field at the bottom of the dialog box, enter the expression me.spec1 == n. Click the OK button. In the same way, enter the following expression in the expression field of the process selector valid condition dialog for process selector 2. me.spec1 == n. We have now set the process selector valid condition so that if spec1 is equal to n, then we go through process 1, but if the process selector valid condition is not equal to n, then we go through process selector 2. Return to the resource Gantt chart and reschedule. If you look at the resource Gantt chart, you can see that some of the orders go through the heat treatment process and others do not, displaying bars on the resource Gantt chart by spec colors. The bars on the resource Gantt chart are currently displayed by order colors. Let's change the settings to display the bars by spec colors. Select Table View, Spec1 from the menu to open the Spec1 table. Enter the values in the Display Color field for the 4 spec codes. Return to the resource Gantt chart. Next, select View, Display Settings from the menu, or click on the Display Settings button on the toolbar to show the display settings for the Gantt chart. Click the Bar tab and select Spec 1 for the Bar Color Method property. Click the OK button. Now the Gantt chart displays the bars by order Spec 1 colors. You can instantly recognize that the orders of which the temperature property is specified as N, the orders in grey, do not pass through the heat treatment process, and the others do. Specifying changeover time due to change of spec. Let's return to the integrated master editor table. We will specify a changeover time occurring from change of spec. Enter 0 as a setup time value for resource HT1's use instruction. Specifying 0 here means this resource will require setup, but the setup time is calculated based on the value specified somewhere else. In this exercise, we will use the spec setup table to specify the setup time. Select Table View, Setup, Spec 1 Spec from the menu to open the Spec 1 Setup table. Basically, you enter one record for each combination of Spec 1 values. We will specify the same values shown in the chart of setups to be required when changing the processing temperature, introduced in the scenario background. You can enter any value in the sort order field, but let's enter 100 for now. This is the original chart of setups to be required when changing the process temperature. Based on this, we will set up the Spec1 setup table. Select the resource HT1. Set the first previous spec to H for high temperature. Set the next spec to M for medium temperature. In setup time, we specify the time required to change between high temperature and medium temperature, which in this case is 60 minutes. In the same way, we'll set all the different combinations of the specs as well. The record in the last row of the table to the right corresponds to combinations of LL, MM and HH. You can enter the records one by one for each combination, but as shown in the diagram, you can also enter one record to indicate the case where the previous spec value and the next spec value are the same. Return to the resource Gantt chart. Reschedule. Let's take a closer look so we can take a look at the setup times. You can confirm that the resource Gantt chart but a setup now occurs between the two heat treatment operations, and the setup times match those specified in the chart of setups to be required when changing the processing temperature. You can clearly see here that changing between low temperature to high temperature results in a setup time of 6 hours. Now, let's return to the Integrated Master Editor table and add a Furnace Resource Worker. The Furnace Resource Worker is HTS. Right-click on Process HT and select Insert, Use Instruction from the pop-up menus. For the newly created use instruction, specify the values as shown. If you specify 0 for setup and production, the schedule will be created in a way to assign both setup and production times. Open the calendar table. Let's specify that resource HTS uses the same calendar as resource HT1. Return to the resource Gantt chart. Let's specify the display color and display order for the new resource using the table part of the resource Gantt chart. Specify 5 as the display color and 8 as the display order. Reschedule. You can confirm that operations for the heat treatment process are assigned both to the heat treatment worker HTS and the furnace HT1 at the same time. Now let's specify resource quantity. Here we will specify a constraint that resource HT1 can perform 3 operations simultaneously, as long as processing temperatures are the same. We will also specify a constraint that worker HTS can operate up to 3 machines. Change to the calendar table. Change the calendar table as shown to specify as if there are 3 resources. Because the resource quantity will change for HT1 and HTS, we need to separate these calendar records. Set the resource quantity for HT1 to 3. Change to the integrated master editor table. We will specify that the worker HTS can operate up to 3 machines. Let's specify the required resource quantity of resource HTS as 0.33, in other words 1 divided by 3. This indicates that HTS can handle up to 3 machines. Return to the resource Gantt chart. Reschedule. Here you can see that resource HT1 can perform up to 3 operations at the same time. In the row of HT1, white lines are displayed indicating that the resource works as 3 resources. On the other hand, no lines are displayed for HTS, indicating that a single worker is to perform multiple operations. Let's take a closer look. Specifying a furnace resource. Here we will specify a furnace resource. We will specify that heat treatment is performed simultaneously for multiple operations when processing temperatures are the same. Pull back the slider to reveal the resource table. Use the resource class to specify HT1 as a furnace resource. Select Furnace Resource Spec 1. Reschedule. The furnace resource setting enables you to parallel only operations with the same Spec 1 value. You can see from the bar colors that operations are now being processed simultaneously only when processing temperatures are the same, and also those operations are scheduled to be input to the furnace at the same time and output from the furnace at the same time. Let's take a closer look. Let's return to the Integrated Master Editor table to specify an outsource resource. The settings for HT1 are almost finished. So next we are going to add an outsourced resource, HTG. Specifying an outsourced resource is basically the same as specifying an internal resource. First, let's add a use instruction for process HT. Specify the values for the use instruction as follows. Set the production to 2 days. Return to the resource Gantt chart. In the same way as before, specify 7 as the display color and 6.5 as the display order for resource HTG. Press the F3 key to redraw the screen with the resources in their new order. Change to the calendar table to record a calendar record for the resource HTG. Specify a calendar record for HTG as shown. Return to the resource Gantt chart. Reschedule. As a result of adding an outsourced resource, in the current schedule, we could assign operations to the outsourced resource, but the operations are also assigned to the worker HTS, indicating that the worker is to be present to watch the outsourced operations as well. We will need to specify it to assign the worker only to the internal operations. Let's change to the Integrated Master Editor table and specify a task selector. When we want to specify combinations of resources, we would use task selectors. Press the function key F3 to redraw the table in the correct order. For the process HT, we will specify 1 as the task selector of the use instructions for HT1 and HTS, and 2 as the task selector of the use instruction for HTG. These settings mean that there are 2 ways to perform process HT. One is to use HT1 and HTS as a pair, and the other is to use HTG alone. Return to the resource Gantt chart. Reschedule. You can see from the resource Gantt chart that HTS is now only used when HT1 is used. Let's take a closer look at resource HTG. You can see that orders with quantities of both 100 and 50 are being sent to the outsourced resource. Here we will need to specify to assign orders with quantity of 50 to internal resources and orders with a quantity of 100 to an outsourced resource. Open the Integrated Master Editor table. For Task Selector 1, select the Task Selector Valid condition and click on the ... button. After the task selector valid condition dialog is displayed, in the expression field at the bottom of the dialog box, enter me.order.quantity less than 100. In the same way, enter the following expression for task selector 2. me.order.quantity is greater than or equal to 100. Return to the resource Gantt chart. Reschedule. You can confirm from the resource Gantt chart that only the orders with a quantity of 100 or more are assigned to resource HTG. With the current master settings, the amount of time required for moving to resource HTG is specified as 60 minutes, the same as for resource HT1. We will specify the move time to mean that resource HTG can start an operation from 0-100 hours of the next day. The current time constraint configuration looks like this. Open the integrated master editor table and change the time constraint min of the use instruction for resource HTG. Select ES for the time constraint method. Set the time constraint min to H1D. Return to the resource Gantt chart. Watch how the time relationship between these two processes changes after we reschedule. You can see from the resource Gantt chart that the operation that is assigned to outsource resource HTG is scheduled to start at 0-100 hours on the next morning, after the operation of the previous process ends. As described in the scenario background, we will specify infinite capacity for resource HTG. Pull back the slider to reveal the resource table. Select non-constrained as the resource quantity constraint for HTG. Reschedule. You can see from the resource Gantt chart that operations on resource HTG are piled freely at infinite capacity. We have now completed the addition of the heat treatment process. Finally, we will specify that production will not be stopped once items are put in the furnace. Select resource HT1 and specify values in the properties Production Suspend Time Max and Setup Suspend Time Max as shown. Specify -1m for the Production Suspend Time Max and the Setup Suspend Time Max. This is the end of Asprova hands-on training 2i. Thank you for watching.